Hello, and welcome to the Metta Hour podcast with Sharon Salzberg. I'm Lily Cushman. I produce this podcast. And today we're bringing you episode 252, the return of Dr. Kristin Neff to the podcast. Kristin is a pioneer in the field of self-compassion research, conducting the first empirical studies on self-compassion over 20 years ago. She is recognized as one of the most influential researchers in psychology worldwide, and she's an associate professor of educational psychology at the University of Texas in Austin. Today, we're celebrating the release of Kristin's new book that she has co-authored with Chris Germer, Mindful Self-Compassion for Burnout. Kristin also runs the Self-Compassion Community, which is an online learning platform to learn the skills of self-compassion. So as always, it's a big treat to have Kristin on the podcast and to see what she's been doing in her work. Today's conversation is mostly about the new book and the intense personal burnout in Kristin's life that led to the writing of this book. And with the amount of burnout that is just so pervasive all over the place right now, this is a super interesting conversation, and one that is strikingly different from a lot of burnout conversations, which just tell you to take a bath or go for a walk. The nuance in this approach to burnout is the work of self-compassion, which Kristin has brilliantly put together in this context. So her and Sharon talk a lot about kind of what happens in burnout, the way that presents in different parts of our lives, the kind of negativity, bias, sinkholes that we can get into, and the necessity of positive states to counteract those experiences. Kristin and Sharon talk about healthy boundaries and Kristin's approach to working with the inner critic, as well as the nuance of how self-compassion shows up. Kristin also shares some new research on self-compassion. And to close the conversation, Sharon does this really fun exercise asking Kristin how self-compassion would respond in a bunch of different situations. So you really get to see it in action. There's also a guided meditation on self-compassion at the end. So this is an incredible conversation. So happy to have Kristin back. Episode 252, Dr. Kristin Neff and Sharon Salzberg.
Hello, Kristin. A big welcome back to the podcast. I'm so glad you're here. So how are you, and where are you recording from today?
I'm in Austin, Texas, and it's such a treat to be able to talk to you again, Sharon. I've really been looking forward to this.
Oh, it's so delightful to talk to you, and it's wonderful to be together again. And we are celebrating the release of your new book that you co-authored with Chris Germer, Mindful Self-Compassion for Burnout, Tools to Help You Heal and Recharge When You're Wrung Out by Stress. Great phrase, which has come out September 13th of 2024 from Guilford Press. So it's so interesting because I've spent, so much of my more recent years of teaching focused on caregivers and, people who either in their personal life or their professional lives are taking care of others. And that includes people like middle managers would call me sometimes and say, am I qualified to come to that course? I feel like I'm taking care of my staff. Or there's so many reasons for burnout, but it does seem to be such a common and powerful experience these days.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely for everyone, whether you're a family caregiver, trying to take care of your kids or your elderly parents, whether you're a professional caregiver, healthcare professional, maybe a therapist, teacher. But also you might say, Sharon, anyone who cares. So if you care about your work, then you're probably going to be stressed about making deadlines and whether or not you're doing a good enough job. I mean, in some ways, the fact of caring makes us ironically vulnerable to burnout because we're invested in being productive and doing well. And so we take on too much and then we become exhausted. And then there we are, where all of a sudden we're burnt out. So it's one of the downsides of caring, you might say, the vulnerability to burnout.
Well, it's true. I mean, that's one of the things I saw with working with caregivers is that people thought it was a flaw, that they're feeling so uneasy, so exhausted, that it was because they didn't care enough or something. But they cared quite a lot, and there were other issues going on. And your book is centered around how to come back from a place of burnout. And it sounds like the writing of it mirrored your own burnout repair process. And I wonder if you could share something about that.
Yeah. So the book, my experience of this book came out of the experience many people had with the COVID pandemic. Like many people, I was, working from home. My son, who is special needs, he's autistic, had to learn over Zoom from home, and he had some challenges trying to do that and navigate it. So I was trying to do my job as a professor, all from home, trying to help him navigate COVID, and then just the fear and not only of getting sick, but supplies and I'd recently actually also gotten divorced, so I was there alone with my son. I didn't have the backup I used to have. His father moved to Germany. So it was a really tough time. And I just felt like so much pressure on me that I was starting to, I would say, teeter on the edge of burnout. I didn't go into full on burnout because of my self-compassion practice. And so I was able to, for instance, when I was feeling just so overwhelmed, to take that pause that I needed and say things to myself like, Kristin, this is so overwhelming. You feel like you don't have any, you feel scared. You feel like you don't have any time for yourself. This is so much. Oh, I'm here for you. Right. So that just those little moments, even though that didn't give me actually any more time, it's not like I could say, oh, great, take a bubble bath. I still was very exhausted. But that ability to turn toward myself and kind of hold my feelings of exhaustion, right, and frustration and fear, I think really prevented me from going into full on burnout. And then also helped me after things got a little better, after the pandemic eased. Well, of course, then what do I do? But I have my 82-year-old mother move in next door to me because I was worried about her. So, it's not like the caregiving really, that the task receded at all. But yeah, just really seeing how this practice of self-compassion helped me deal with the stressors in a way that prevented me from going full on into burnout and also recovering from some of the feelings of exhaustion caused by the pandemic. I had the idea, well, why don't we write a book about it? Even though I have to say, Sharon, it was hard to write the book because I was so exhausted. I kept on thinking,
right.
I'm too exhausted to write this, but I knew it was just so necessary for the world that I managed to put one foot in front of the other and get it done with the help of my very close colleague, Chris Germer, of course.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
So for any listeners who are new to you and your work, I want to point folks to episodes 98 and 159 of the Metta Hour to hear our previous conversations. And in that light, I wonder if you can give us your current working definition of compassion and self-compassion.
Yeah. So often I like to go to the Latin roots of compassion because I think it's just very obvious what it is. If you think of passion as pointing to suffering, like the passion of the Christ, right? It means suffering. And then come simply means with. So you can think of it as how do we show up for suffering, whether it's the suffering of others, which is compassion for others, or how do we show up for ourselves when we're suffering? Right. And it doesn't have to be big, major suffering. It might be feeling a little insecure or feeling like you made a mistake or having that rash or whatever it is, any sort of discomfort. How do we show up for ourselves in that moment? So basically in my model, I talk about three different ways we need to show up for ourselves to be compassionate. One is with mindfulness, and that's simply the willingness to keep our awareness on the fact that we're hurting. As you know, Sharon, when we're hurting in some way, and especially when we're hurting because we feel some shame or we feel bad about something we've done, the last thing we want to do is be aware of it. We'd like to either forget it, hide it, blame someone else for it. And that's one way to go. We repress it. Or what happens is we get overwhelmed by the negative thoughts and feelings. We kind of identify with them. We get lost in them. And so mindfulness, one of the beauties of mindfulness is it gives us some space to be with our difficult feelings without having to ignore them or fight them, but also without being overwhelmed by them. So you might say that's like step one. Okay, suffering is here. Can I be with it? Okay, ow, this hurts. This is hard. And then we need to respond with kindness. So it's more than just giving space to something or being aware of something. Our heart also opens to the pain. Again, whether we're more used to this when it's the pain of others that we care about, that our heart opens when we realize that we're struggling. And so self-compassion, the trick is allowing your heart to open to yourself, to actually be moved by the fact that it's difficult. And really importantly, one of the ways they define compassion in the field of psychology is the motivation to alleviate suffering. So we notice that we're hurting in some way, and then there's this arising, this kind of benevolence that arises that makes us want to help ourselves in some way. And then the third element, which actually is interesting, most people don't necessarily include in their definition of compassion, but I think it's really, really key, is broadening beyond our separate self and understanding that, what's happening is bigger than just us, right? So often when we fail or we make a mistake or we're hurting, we feel like it's just me. We feel very isolated. We get very self-focused. With compassion, we realize, hey, we're part of a larger whole. First of all, human beings, to be human beings, to make mistakes or to fail or to go through struggles, remembering that it's not just me. But even more than that, kind of understanding how we are part of this larger web of causes and conditions. So what we do or what happens to us is intricately connected to a lot of people and events and situations that are more than just us. And so you might say what we're doing with self-compassion, even though the word itself is there, we're actually softening our sense of separation from others and adopting this more connected way of being. So those three elements, the connection, the warmth, and the mindfulness, is really what makes self-compassion from my point of view.
I find that there's still a strong myth around self-compassion, that it's weak, it makes you give in to situations that are really unfair, and it's just a generally kind of simplistic or saccharine sort of state. And you wrote quite a lot about this in your last book, Fierce Self-Compassion. But I'm curious how relevant that is with your work now, and why do you think self-compassion is still often misunderstood to be weakness? Is it just a kind of pervasive cultural conditioning or something else?
I think it is a cultural conditioning. So, for instance, I always get excited if a journalist wants to write a piece about self-compassion and they interview me, and inevitably they title it like "Give yourself a break" or "Go easier on yourself," which I think which promotes these myths. And so sometimes self-compassion does involve giving yourself a break or going easier on yourself, perhaps not driving yourself so ruthlessly. But it's really important to remember that, again, the core of self-compassion is alleviating suffering. And if giving yourself a break means you're being complacent or you aren't reaching your goals that you want, need to fulfill yourself or to be happy, that's actually not compassionate. So part of compassion comes from acceptance of ourselves as flawed human beings, acceptance of the human condition that's imperfect. We feel pain. That's, we can't fight against that reality because we'll just be banging our head against the wall. But it's not only about acceptance. It's also about taking action to alleviate our suffering. So a good example is burnout. So when I wrote the book Fierce Self-Compassion, this was right on the heels of the Me Too movement. And I was thinking about, all these women standing up and as an act of self-compassion saying, no, no, you can't do that to me. I will not take that anymore. It's not okay. which is one way of taking action with self-compassion. And with burnout, it's also similar. So sometimes it is drawing boundaries. Oftentimes we're burnt out because we try to be nice and do everything that people ask of us because we want them to like us. So sure, I'll work that extra shift, or yeah, I'll work on the weekends, or take your call, or, part of not being so burnt out is learning to draw boundaries and say no so that we don't become overwhelmed. We don't give ourselves away to the demands of others. And also changing situations. I know a lot of healthcare workers, and I love talking to healthcare workers about self-compassion. And they say, yeah, but it's not like just because we're beating ourselves up that we're so burnt out. It's the system is broken. And it's like, yes, absolutely. Part of self-compassion is taking action to change broken social systems, whether that's joining a union or going on strike, or who knows what that may mean, or just talking to the administration. But it's not just about accepting the status quo. So fierce self-compassion is really about making the changes either into ourselves and our own lives or to the social situation to alleviate suffering. One without the other is incomplete. It's like, you need both yin and yang energy to be healthy.
That's great. So let's get more into the book, Mindful Self-Compassion for Burnout. Here's a quotation from the book. The purpose of self-compassion is not to make you feel better. Self-compassion changes the way you deal with the distress of burnout so that you stop avoiding it, beating yourself up for it, or judging yourself as somehow deficient because you can't do it all.
Yeah. So this is really why self-compassion is so helpful. So burnout, the main causes of burnout is just being overwhelmed, right? You're given too much work, or you're, you aren't given, you don't have the resources to deal with the task demands placed on you. And so that leads to exhaustion. And then what happens is we start blaming ourselves, like we think we should be able to be up to the up to the task of dealing with what we're supposed to do, and so we think there's something wrong with us because we're so exhausted. And then the process, which the psychological term is depersonalization, which basically means we stop caring as much. We start shutting down, numbing out because we feel so overwhelmed, right? If we care, then in a way, we're kind of vulnerable. If we care, we're vulnerable to burnout because we want to do well and we get upset when we don't. One of the ways we deal with not being able to cope is we just shut down. So if you think about what happens when that moment of exhaustion, or that the task demands are exceeding my resources to meet them, what self-compassion can do is, again, it's not like magic dust. It's going to suddenly make the problems go away. You're still feeling overwhelmed, right? But instead of just blaming yourself for it or sitting down because you can't handle it, you actually say, this is so hard. I feel overwhelmed. Well, human beings, sometimes they do feel overwhelmed. I'm not supposed to be perfect. I'm not superhuman. I'm just going to do the best I can in the moment, right? And so the moment you switch from blaming yourself and judging yourself and shutting down your heart to treating yourself like with kindness and understanding, hey, just put one foot on the other, do as best you can. I'm here for you. How can I help? Then that mindset shift is really what helps avoid these processes of judging yourself and shutting down, in addition to feelings of overwhelmed. So that's one of the reasons there's so much research showing that self-compassion reduces burnout, because we aren't exacerbating the stress of an already stressful situation by beating ourselves up.
So just to go over this a little bit, you define burnout with three main characteristics. One is exhaustion, feeling drained and fatigued with nothing left to give. The second is depersonalization. You were just talking about that. Right. Feeling detached, cynical, or negative about your work. And then the third is reduced accomplishment, feeling ineffective, inept, or incompetent. And I wonder if you could talk a little bit about why you think it's useful to name these symptoms of burnout as a starting point.
Yeah, well, because sometimes all we can feel is the exhaustion. That's kind of in some ways the most obvious symptom. We're just so tired. I don't want to get out of bed. And so that does need to be dealt with. And again, if we can take a little time to deal with the feelings of exhaustion, that's helpful. But these other two are really pernicious, right? So let's talk about the reduced accomplishment. What happens when we feel like I should be able to get out of bed? What's wrong with me for not being able to get out of bed or not wanting to get out of bed? When we judge ourselves and we blame ourselves. And by the way, Sharon, it's important that we have compassion for the fact that we do this, because it's so natural. We would like to feel in control. We'd like to feel as if I were just a little stronger. I'd be able to handle working 3 jobs or whatever the impossible task is. It almost feels safer to think there's something wrong with me for not being able to do it than to open to the kind of vulnerable place of, yeah, sometimes it's just too much. Sometimes it's beyond my ability to rise to the task. So, but when we judge ourselves and take it personally, so to speak, then we start feeling these sense of being ineffective. I'm a loser. There's something wrong with me. And then we start the downward spiral because we feel stressed. And actually, there's research that shows when you criticize yourself, it raises your cortisol levels. So you're actually stressing yourself because you're judging yourself for being so stressed, which exacerbates your stress. And then down we go. So, again, sometimes just bringing some attention to that, you might say these are 3 different ways we might ease the pain of burnout. One might be, instead of just judging yourself, saying something like, hey, I'm a human being. I'm doing the best I can. I mean, just put one foot in front of the other, then you actually reduce those feelings of judgment. Depersonalization, right? Having to close down. You don't have to close yourself down to the pain of being so overwhelmed if you give yourself support, right? Which is, again, the mindfulness, remembering the connectedness, the feelings of warmth. My heart hurts. When your heart hurts and you acknowledge that your heart hurts and you say, I'm here for you, I care, then that's actually what allows you to keep your heart open. And then the feelings of exhaustion. So when we are exacerbating things, that helps a little bit. We may be able to draw a boundary. We may be able to take a little break for ourselves. Again, I have to be honest, sometimes you actually can't. Sometimes the demands are so overwhelming that you actually can't take a break. If you can, self-compassion will lead you to try to take a break for yourself. But if you can't, at least you aren't making things worse by adding the stress and the kind of agitated mental mind state of the fact that, there's something wrong with me because I can't hack the stress.
Mm-hmm. You're reminding me of when I wrote a book years ago, Real Happiness at Work, and I was on some radio show being interviewed along with somebody else speaking about work, and the anchor person asked a question, and the other person said, well, not everyone can leave their job,
Yeah.
Like, you can't always just quit.
Exactly, right.
Oh, right.
I mean, just think about the pandemic, right? We were all in that situation. We didn't have a lot of choice.
Yeah.
But when you support yourself in those seemingly impossible situations, it's a lot better than thinking that somehow you should be able to be in charge and judging yourself because you can't.
Mm-hmm.
But at the same time, so if that little voice is saying, oh, does that mean I'm going to be passive? No, that's
Right.
where the fear of self-compassion comes in. If you care, you're going to do your very best, but not because you have to be adequate, simply because you want to, because you care.
That's wonderful. So I also want to mention for everybody that the book has lots of fun quizzes and such, which I always love. So it's a very interactive tool, almost like a workbook.
Yeah. So one of our goals, when I had the idea to write this workbook, and I called up Chris Germer and I said, should we do this? Because we had actually written a general mindful self-compassion workbook. And one of the ideas was to apply these tools specifically to the context of burnout. One of the key criteria was this can't be a boring read. It can't be a long read. We have to have some humor. We have to make it light, because the last thing a person who's burned out needs is something like that feels like a homework assignment. So we really, and I think we succeeded fairly well. Anyway, I'm pretty proud of it, that we tried to make it entertaining, the writing, have lots of stories, lots of, again, quizzes, things to do. It's tried to make it fairly light. So that it doesn't feel like another chore or something else on your to-do list.
It's great. So what strikes me about this book is that you're applying self-compassion in two distinctly different ways. One is facing our burnout symptoms and the difficult thoughts and emotions that go with that. And the other is about the cultivation of positive states, like connecting with our core values, knowing our core strengths, and savoring the good. So, can you talk about why both of these aspects are important?
Yes, absolutely. So one of the things that happens with burnout, and actually any really negative state, is our focus narrows. There's actually something called the negativity bias, where this is just given through evolution. If we feel threatened in some way, we kind of block out all other information other than the threat, other than the problem, so we can marshal all our resources to try to solve the problem and to be safe. And so what happens when we start feeling overwhelmed and we start feeling exhausted and we start feeling burnout, our focus really narrows just to everything that we aren't getting done, or all the tasks that are on our plate. In other words, everything that's wrong. And we totally start overlooking everything that's right. So even when you're very stressed and burned out, there's probably a lot of things that are still going right. Maybe you still have your health, or you still have your job, or actually maybe it's a nice day outside, or your kids are are healthier. There's usually a lot of things going right in our life that we totally lose sight of because we're so focused on solving the problem of burnout. And so again, this is where we lead into this negative cycle, because we're focused on the negative and we judge ourselves for it, and we just feel isolated. And then, it gets more and more until at some point we're like this little pinpoint of negativity, and we're just like sucked into that sinkhole. So a really good way to get ourselves out of that negative sinkhole is just to intentionally look around and say, well, actually, what is good about this moment? You can even look, I'm looking right now. Well, my computer works. Well, it doesn't always work. So it's a wonderful thing that my computer is working and the lights are working, and, it's a nice day, and, I've got my health. And, if you actually do this intentionally, savoring the good, what's right instead of what's wrong. And one of the things it does is there's a whole field of positive psychology, and I'm sure you know all about it, Sharon. But what it does is it actually broadens our attention. It allows us to see the bigger picture, the part of the glass that's half full as well as half empty. And that's what allows us to get out of that sinkhole of burnout and to have a broader perspective. And the good thing about that is when we start seeing the bigger picture, then there might be some opportunities that we haven't thought about that may be a better choice for us. Maybe there is a boundary we can draw, or maybe we can make a different plan for ourselves, or maybe we can make a different choice that we didn't even think about before because we are so focused on the problems. So that's about savoring the good. And then related to that is our core values. So core values are really, so you might say savoring the good is more about just immediately what's good in our lives right now. Our values is about where we want to be going in our lives. Not so much like particular goals or things, things we want to check off in terms of to do. We want to get a degree or reach this goal. It's really about what motivates us. What do we care about? What's meaningful to us? So for instance, if you're a healthcare worker, usually you went into healthcare because you cared about people, and you wanted to help them. What can happen if you're burnt out is because you feel so overwhelmed, and then you're judging yourself and you're in this negative spiral, you just start thinking that this is just a job. It's just one more, patient to see, just more paperwork to fill out. And you kind of lose sight of your value of actually the reason I went into this field is because I wanted to help people. And so reconnecting with why we're doing what we're doing, instead of just focusing on, what I have to do, but why am I here? What's meaningful to me? Then that can help really help energize us. In fact, it's interesting. One of the ways you can tell whether the action you're doing is in line with your core values, or maybe something you just think you're supposed to do, is if you think of it as something you're supposed to do, it's going to drain you. But if it's something that's actually in line with your core values, like let's say you're giving out, I don't know, sandwiches to homeless people. If you're doing it because you have to do it, maybe it's just your job, it's going to be, oh my God, I got to hand out more sandwiches. But if it's like you really care and this is something so meaningful to you to help these people who are struggling, then it's going to energize you to do that very same action. So acting in alignment with our core values energizes us. Doing it because we have to drains us. And that's one of the reasons it can actually help directly pull us out of burnout.
So I want to zoom in on a few specifics in the book, one of which is boundaries, which is such a fascinating topic. And I'm often asked about that. And sometimes I try to describe boundaries, when they're healthy boundaries, as the courageous expression of compassion for ourselves. And I'm wondering if you can share how you approach them.
Yeah. Well, I think that's a great definition. I would definitely agree with that. I also love Prentice Hemphill's definition that boundaries are the place where I can love you and me simultaneously. Right. So because boundaries usually is boundaries with someone else, right? Or some people that are asking something of you or wanting you to do something. And often we don't draw boundaries. There's a lot of reasons. I think some of this is a socialization. So, for instance, women may not draw a boundary. Maybe her kids are asking, too much of her, and she may not draw the boundary because, well, good mothers, yes, they do that. They do everything their kids ask of them. That might be an example. Or at work, right? We may be afraid to say no because, we want people to like us. We want people to value us. And so the fact that you use the word courage, I really like, because it takes courage to draw a boundary, to say, my needs are important too. It's not saying that they're more important than the needs of other people, but they're equally important as the needs of other people. And the ability to risk, I'll be honest, Sharon, people don't really like it when we draw boundaries. They're actually much more pleased with the situation when we're just saying, yes, 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 of course, no problem, no problem. And so it takes a little courage to say, I would love to help, but no, I can't. I need to take care of myself, or it's just not going to work for me right now. And then you have to risk them not liking you a little bit. Maybe they like you a little bit less, at least temporarily. But the important thing is you can like yourself a little bit more. Right? When you start caring about yourself and you start valuing more this question of, is this authentic for me? Is this something I really want to do? Is this something that's good for me? Then you can risk other people's disapproval a little bit more and start focusing on what's authentic and it's going to feed you. But but it's not like, so I did some research. Let's come back to the data. I did some research where I asked people about, well, what do you do when there's a conflict situation where, someone you care about, maybe your family member, your significant other, your child there's a conflict situation where they want one thing and you want the other. Self-compassionate people, they weren't doormats. They didn't just like, okay, I'll do what they want, but they also didn't prioritize myself. It's not like they said, my way or the highway. Oh, let's choose what I want. What they really talked about was compromise. How can we come up with a win-win situation where the other person gets their needs met and I get my needs met? And that's really what self-compassion is about. In my point of view, is finding a balance so that, again, I can love you and me simultaneously.
The word balance is what came to my mind. Like, we would call it balance, right?
Exactly. So, people, we often tend to be such simplistic thinkers, black and white thinkers. Self-compassion takes a little more complexity where we think, okay, well, maybe I don't get everything I want. Maybe the other person doesn't get everything they want. How can we collaborate on finding a mutually beneficial solution? So self-compassion isn't to the exclusion of others. It's simply including ourselves. It's actually more common for us to exclude ourselves and just have our compassion flow one way. With self-compassion, it flows both inward and outward in this balanced manner.
And another topic from the book is understanding the inner critic, which is such a valuable tool, the understanding, not the inner critic.
Yes.
And I know we've talked about the inner critic in various ways before, but I'm wondering how you would say it figures into burnout recovery.
Yeah. So, it's really important whenever talking about the inner critic to understand like what's driving the inner critic, why is it there? So the inner critic stems from a basic desire to be safe. So through evolution, when we're threatened, our natural response is to go into fight, flight, or freeze. And so what happens, especially when we're overwhelmed and we feel threatened, is we fight ourselves because we feel like the problem's internal. I can't cope with it. So we criticize ourselves, hoping, this isn't really rational, but we hope that somehow if I just harsh enough with myself, someone will be able to like muster the strength to do something different. Or we flee into a sense of shame and isolation. Like we feel overwhelmed. So we just hang our head in shame. That's when we can't get out of bed because we just kind of want to imagine the judgment or the tasks that are so overwhelming out there. So we kind of hide into our bed. We retreat, or we freeze and we get stuck. That's when we get immobilized, right? Fight, flight, or freeze. These are natural responses designed by evolution to help us feel safe when we're threatened in some way. So if you're beating yourself up because you feel burnt out, or if you're beating yourself up for any reason, please don't beat yourself up for beating yourself up, because it really is stemming from it. Some part of us is we just want to be safe. We just want to survive. And this is kind of one of the main tools evolution has equipped us with. So once we understand that, okay, this just comes from the desire to be safe, then we can start thinking of, are there other maybe more effective ways we could be safe? Because unfortunately, beating ourselves up, shaming ourselves, and getting stuck does not help very much, right? And so the good news is we have another safety mechanism that evolved but really evolved more to keep others safe. And it's called the care system. So it evolved for this natural instinct to care for our family members or our friends or our in-group members. That's also a natural instinct, but it did evolve more to care for others. So what we're doing with self-compassion is we're tapping into the system, the care system that evolved for others, and we're using it with ourselves. And what we know from the research is, let's say, you want to motivate some change in yourself, that the care system, giving yourself encouragement, doing it, out of care and warmth and support, is actually more effective in helping you make that change than just beating yourself up.
So since you said the word research, like the magic word, I don't think I've ever talked about, say, in a room full of people, talked about self-compassion without someone raising their hand and looking at me either with pity or disdain and saying, well, that's just being lazy, And because I am not a scientist, and I usually say, I hear there's research that shows that self-compassion actually is a more effective way to grow or make a change or something. So I wonder if you could just say something about the research.
Great. Okay. Yeah. So your listeners don't just have to believe me when I say it's more effective. You want a little data? So I'll give you a little data. I love the data. So a few years ago, I had a graduate student who was actually a student athlete, and she had found self-compassion and found it really helped her in athletics. But most athletes, of course, they think self-compassion is weak or that it's soft, and they think it's more effective for them to be at the top of their game if they're really harsh with themselves. And she had found in her experience that actually being encouraging and warm with self-compassion was more effective. So this is for her dissertation. We did this study where we recruited NCAA athletes. So these are athletes that are at the top of their game. Oftentimes they want to go into the pros after college, and their scholarships are riding on, being really good athletes. And so second best is not good enough if you're an NCAA athlete. You have to be at the top of your game. So we train them to be self-compassionate when they had maybe a setback in their game or their training routine. And so first of all, we actually, you'll find this interesting. We didn't use the word self-compassion because it was too loaded. We called it inner strength training, which is actually true, but it's more effective. And so we taught them to imagine when they had a setback or there's some sort of failure in their sport, we had them imagine the most, first of all, constructive, kind, but helpful coach they could imagine. So a helpful coach doesn't say, oh no, that's fine that you screwed up. A helpful coach tries to help you figure out where you went wrong and how to fix it. That's what's helpful. So we had them use this kind of image of a really helpful, kind, constructive coach that helped them improve their game. And what we found is, so we had that compared to a control group where we didn't give them any instruction. So basically, the average way people try to motivate themselves is through criticism. And we found that those athletes who were trained to give themselves compassion for their setbacks in their training routines actually improved their game. Their athletic performance improved compared to people in the control group. And it makes sense. I mean, think about it. If you want to motivate your friend to do better, do you say like, oh, you're such a lazy slob or fool, I hate you? Versus, I believe in you. You can do it. How can I help? And maybe you may want to try this, not because you're stupid, but just because you tried this out, see if it works better. We know that's going to be more effective. We know that instinctually for others, but we forget that for ourselves.
So fantastic. And I'd love for us to play together a little bit and for me to ask you how self-compassion might figure in different scenarios. Is that okay?
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, great. So let's say, number one, you're in line getting groceries, and after waiting for quite a long time, you reach the checkout. And when it's time to pay, you realize you've left your wallet at home. What does self-compassion say?
Right. So the first step of self-compassion, so most people would probably just say, oh, I'm such an idiot. The first step of self-compassion is just kind of acknowledging the pain of that, like, ooh, ouch, that's hard, right? I was just waiting and I left my wallet at home and that's a lot of wasted time. So that's the mindfulness, kind of acknowledging the pain of it. The common humanity would help us remember, hey, this happens, right? I'm a busy person. So there's a lot, people forget their wallets. Actually, my son just called me up in a very similar situation. And what I told him is, hey, don't worry, it happens to everyone. But what I said to my son is the same thing one would say to yourself. You don't want to go around leaving your wallet everywhere because that's also going to cause you suffering, right? And so I told my son to actually help him. I actually had him buy one of those wallets he wears around his neck. Mm-hmm. My son's autistic. For him, that was a good solution. But in other words, part of self-compassion, the kindness is not only saying, hey, it's okay, it happens to everyone, acknowledging the pain, but also, is there anything I might be able to do differently to help me so it doesn't happen again? So that's one way, one type of reaction. Again, acknowledging the pain, remembering that it's only human, you aren't alone, being warm and supportive, but also encouraging, is there any sort of change you might make that may help reduce the chances of this painful thing happening again?
Okay, so here's another one.
Okay.
At work, a coworker is being quite contentious, and they're going through a bitter separation at home, but you're tired of being blamed for something that isn't your responsibility. So what does self-compassion say in this scenario?
Yeah. So in terms of what you would say in this scenario, so one of the things is that I can't say from the outside, there's so many variables here. What I would say is that this is probably calls for both tender and fierce self-compassion. So the tender self-compassion means, first of all, maybe usually starting with yourself, like putting your own oxygen mask on first, acknowledging the pain of being blamed for maybe this person's behavior is causing problems for you, right? And so just acknowledging, yeah, that's hard. In other words, instead of immediately going to, oh, they're going through a bitter separation, I'm not going to even acknowledge my own pain. Who am I to complain they're going through a separation? So acknowledging your own pain, yeah, it's hard. It's difficult for me. It's, unpleasant to work with this person. I'm getting blamed for stuff. So acknowledging your pain first, and then acknowledging their pain. Well, I can see they aren't, doing it on purpose. They do have a lot of stress. They're, going through something at home. So that's kind of the tender self-compassion, acknowledging your pain, accepting your pain, acknowledging their pain, accepting it. But then asking with the fierce self-compassion, is there anything I should say? Maybe. And again, you may decide, given this person's circumstance, that actually the best thing to do is not to say anything, right, to anyone, and just maybe you think it'll pass. But if it's a real problem, you may consider maybe drawing some sort of boundary, having a talk with them or maybe talk with your superiors. Again, only wisdom really can let you know what's the right thing to do in that situation. But these features need to be here. Accepting your own pain, accepting the other person's pain, and then they're asking yourself, is there anything I could do that may help this situation?
You kind of sense the exquisite balance between compassion for yourself and compassion for others, between caring about someone but having a kind of rightful sense of limits.
Yes, exactly.
There's a lot of things coming together. So one last one.
Okay.
Your elderly uncle is posting political memes on Instagram. I don't know how they learned how to use Instagram. I can barely use
Right.
Instagram. But anyway, your elderly uncle is posting political memes on Instagram that read to you as wrong or maybe even frankly racist. You know you're going to see him at a family picnic this weekend and that he will probably bring up political questions to pick a fight with you. What does self-compassion say?
Yeah. So, and I know so many people. I'm not in this situation. All my family shares same political points of view, but I know a lot of people where the political divisiveness in the U.S. Has really torn families apart, and it's such a difficult situation. Okay, so self-compassion again, it's going to be kind of similar. The first thing to do is instead of saying stop, attacking your uncle or drawing a boundary, which we'll get there. The first thing to do is to acknowledge the pain of that. Right. That's hard. Maybe, you eat your uncle. You love your uncle. You grew up with your uncle. It's painful to know that your uncle is posting these racist things. So starting with the pain, acknowledging the pain. This is hard for me. Ouch. It makes me sad. It makes me feel disconnected from my uncle. Okay. So you start with the tender self-compassion for yourself. And then, so you may or may not choose to do this actually. So there's two other elements that come in here. One may be having some understanding for your uncle. He's elderly. He knows their history. You don't actually, I would say this is optional because sometimes we also need the fierce self-compassion about the speaking up and drawing boundaries. Sometimes we don't, we want to like, that the compassion for the others sometimes comes maybe a little later in the process. You may want to, and again, I'm not going to say what you should do, but the fierce self-compassion, if you decide it's the right thing to say something to your uncle, like for instance, please don't speak to me about this. It really, it causes divisiveness. It hurts. If you decide to say something, then you may want to go straight to the strong back that the self-compassion gives you of drawing that boundary and that wall to protect yourself, right? So that may be the first thing you do. And then after doing that, after getting the safety because they aren't talking to you, then maybe you want to think about some compassion for your uncle so you don't just see them as a horrible person, but understand the factors that led them to act as they do. So in other words, there's a lot of different self-compassion doesn't say what to do exactly. It kind of brings up these factors of the things we need to consider: our own pain, the other person's pain, and taking action to alleviate suffering, whether that's drawing boundaries, whether that's speaking up. Really, only wisdom can tell you exactly what to do. So for instance, I'm just going to say something. Some people they've talked to me about this. They decide not to say anything because, and that actually may be a valid choice. If the pain caused by saying something is going to be so divisive for the family that they decide, actually, I think wisdom tells me that not saying anything is the best way to handle that. That's okay. No one can say from the outside whether or not that's the right choice. But if that is your choice, then first of all, you need to really double down on giving the internal self-compassion. In other words, I have the right to say something. I'm not happy about it. This hurts. So really giving to that to yourself fully, because of the pain, and perhaps deciding maybe saying something is the right thing, not saying something is the right thing to do. Who am I to say? So it depends on so many factors. Is that the answer you would have given, Sharon? I'm curious.
Yeah, I think sometimes when I've been in a situation where someone's, presence has just been like icy cold or mean or seems like putting me down, in some
Yeah.
way. Sometimes I'd say to myself, I am in this person's energy for like a minute and a half and they live in it, like
Yes, right. Yeah, which is
something like that.
compassion.
And
Yeah,
and just
nice.
trying to translate bad and horrible and terrible to
Yes,
painful. But that doesn't
right.
mean inconsequential, like people
Yes,
in pain cause pain
they do.
often, each of us. And so it's not to dismiss, um, the actions are consequential or to pretend that all views are
Yes,
equal, which I think is another giant fallacy. Um,
exactly.
it's not that, as you say, wisdom. There's wisdom.
And in general, I generally find it helps to start with yourself before extending it to others. Because if you're just simmering with anger and resentment,
Hmm.
and it's really hard to be compassionate to others. But
Yeah, yeah.
if your heart feels supported and safe, then it's a little easier to have that compassion for others. That's
Hmm.
my own experience anyway.
So before we go, I wanted to ask you about the self-compassion community you're building on your website. So what's that all about?
Yeah, so that's something really exciting. A few months ago in March of 2024, I started a membership community because, again, one of the things that the problems of modern life is we all feel so isolated. Most of our interactions, especially after the pandemic, have been reduced. We aren't hanging out with other people as much. For instance, I'm not doing live events as much as I used to. So I wanted to figure out a way that would help people come together who want to practice self-compassion. Because again, even though the word self is there, it really helps to practice compassion with others, right? Because it's not natural. It doesn't come natural to us as human beings. So we know that other people are struggling with self-compassion and also getting some guidance from people who've had some training and teaching self-compassion is just so helpful. So I created this community where we have a community gatherings. I have a gathering once a month where I ask people questions. I have guest gatherings, and actually, you might get an invite from me at some point, Sharon, if you'd be willing to come talk
Hmm.
to my community someday.
I
So,
would
for
be
instance,
delighted. I'd be
I
so
just had Dan
happy.
Siegel on, and Ray Hansen was on. Tara Brock's going to come, so you're going to be getting invitations soon. So we
Great.
have guests comes in, and we have mentor sessions where people can get a mentoring from trained self compassion teachers to help them with struggles. We're going to start these free intro to self compassion sessions for people who want to learn about it. Instead of just like reading what's on my website, they actually can have a live event with other people, ask questions. I have a whole bunch of new practices for members. I've got videos. So it's really a little mini self-compassion world for people that want to go deeper and have other ways to develop their practice. So I've been having a lot of fun with it.
That's great.
And by the way, we have scholarships. So if it's pretty cheap, but if money is a barrier, we don't turn anyone away for financial reasons. So
That's so wonderful because I think what I found is that people are so longing for a sense of community.
yes,
It's so
exactly.
important in our
Yeah.
time, maybe at all times, but certainly in our time.
Yeah, absolutely.
So, to finish our conversation, I'm hoping you will lead us in a self compassion meditation.
Yes, I would love to. Um, so I'd like to lead something we call the self-compassion break. And we call it a break because, first of all, it's kind of a break from our normal way of thinking, which might be cold or mean to ourselves. It's also something you can do with like a timeout in the middle of your day. You can take a 5-minute break to do this practice. It's very short. And the idea is we bring the 3 elements of compassion, which are, again, mindfulness, a sense of common humanity, and kindness, to some experience of pain or discomfort we're having. So, if everyone who's listening, including you, Sharon, maybe just closing your eyes and settling into your body. So, just coming to the present moment, and in part by feeling your feet on the floor or feeling the weight of your body on your chair. Just noticing that transition from our normal thinking minds to just being in our body. And then checking in with yourself and noticing, is there anything happening right now in your life that's causing you some distress? Right? Maybe you're anxious about something, or maybe you've done something you regret, feeling bad about yourself for some reason, maybe a stressor, maybe a health issue. Uh, Please don't think of anything that's really overwhelmingly difficult, because when we're feeling overwhelmed, it's going to be hard for you actually to learn this practice. So, something that's mild to moderately difficult in your life, just call that to mind. Right. So this is, this is happening in your lives. So the first thing we want to do is to bring in some mindfulness. So instead of fighting the pain or suppressing it or running away with it, see if we can just, first of all, be with it. And just be with the fact that this is hard. It's hard to experience this. Can you make a little space for this pain in your life? Ouch. And also remembering, the humanity of your experience. This is what happens when you're a human being. If it's a mistake you've made or feeling badly about yourself for something, well, this is what it means to be human. Or if it's some stressor, maybe a health issue or a conflict, this also happens to humans. And so see if you can actually remember that this difficult situation, this actually connects you to other people. You aren't alone. This is part of the shared human experience. And then what we want to do is bring some warmth and kindness to ourselves because it hurts. Right? So again, just remembering what it is you're struggling with. And maybe if you want, putting your hand on your body, over your heart or your face, or some sort of physical gesture of warmth. Really letting yourself know, I'm here for you. Feeling the warmth of your hand on your body, and then perhaps saying some words of kindness or encouragement or support to yourself. Like, it's okay to be imperfect. We'll get through this. What do you need right now? I'm so sorry. This is so painful. If it feels comfortable, even maybe, thinking about what you would say to a good friend who was in a similar situation. I care about you. How can I help? And then try saying something similar to yourself. Just see if you can let those feelings of warmth in. It may feel a little uncomfortable. That's also natural. That's also human. You can give yourself permission to receive some of the compassion from yourself that you more easily give to others. And then when you're ready, you can open your eyes. So it doesn't take long. Really, we just want to bring in the mindfulness of the pain, the remembering that we aren't alone in this, and then the warmth and the kindness.
Well, thank you so much for that. It was a beautiful meditation, and it's so great to be together again. Thank you so much for coming.
Yes, thank you so much, Sharon. I appreciate you so much, and you've just been such a leading voice of compassion in the world, and also just to me personally, just been so good to me over the years. So I really appreciate you.
Oh, thank you. And congratulations again on your new book, Mindful Self-Compassion for Burnout, which is available in hardcover, paperback, and ebook formats, and all the places books are sold.
Hey folks, thanks so much for listening. If you'd like to learn more about Kristin's work or get yourself a copy of her new book, Mindful Self-Compassion for Burnout, you can head over to her website, selfcompassion.org. That is self-compassion, compassion.org. And there you will also find her self-compassion online community and lots of fun free quizzes. You can take the self-compassion quiz, and who doesn't love a quiz? And for all things Sharon, including her election resources, virtual classes, online courses, and of course her many books, you can head over to SharonSalzberg.com. This has been the Metta Hour podcast, brought to you by the Be Here Now Network. May you be safe. May you be happy, may you be healthy, and may you live with ease.